everybody, it's me again, Cave Cat. Normally I would be doing an episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews, a Garfield sound project, or any other miscellaneous video that I can think of. However, I'm doing a different kind of video for a change. For this one, I'm going to be conveying my thoughts on an animated film that I'm looking forward to seeing this year. As you might have guessed, I'll be talking about the upcoming Garfield movie. I mentioned this before my Garfield and Friends review, but I am a huge Garfield fan, having owned a lot of the comic collections until I gave them away, owning a few Garfield plush toys, and even owning several Garfield DVDs. I even owned the DVDs of the first two live-action Garfield films, watching them on occasion, but in my opinion, they're not as good as the actual Garfield comics, the Garfield specials, or even the Garfield and Friends TV series. Because for one thing, they animated Garfield in CG in almost the same style as when they animated Scooby-Doo in CG for the live-action Scooby-Doo movies, or even when they animated Alvin and the Chipmunks in CG for their live-action films as well. And there was also the time when they made those CGI direct-to-video Garfield films, which were Garfield Gets Real, Garfield's Fun Fest, and Garfield's Pet Force. I remember watching Garfield Gets Real and Garfield's Fun Fest, but I've not seen Garfield's Pet Force, and I thought that the first two movies were rather decent in my opinion. And as for the Garfield show, it's pretty decent, but the humor really pales in comparison to that of Garfield and Friends. And then there's also Garfield Originals, which was aired on Nickelodeon, but I've never seen that show, so I don't know what to think of it. I think there's a good chance that the Garfield movie will actually turn out to be very good. For one thing, it's being directed by Mark Dindal, whom a lot of you might remember for directing such films as Cats Don't Dance, The Emperor's New Groove, and Chicken Little. Although, in the case of the latter, I've heard about how that film wasn't really received very well, due to the fact that the characters were rather flat and didn't really have any redeeming qualities about them, and also how the film was just Disney's attempt to try and copy DreamWorks, which, yeah, it does. And not to mention that it just completely blows the original Chicken Little Henny Penny story out of proportion, and tries to add in the concept of an alien invasion, which makes the film all the more convoluted. But with this film, at least it looks like it's trying to keep true to the spirit of the original Garfield comics and actually keep some things true to the source material, compared to the live-action films from about 2 decades ago. I mean, yeah, it does kind of change a few things around from the original comics like the live-action films did. In the original comics, Garfield was said to be born in the kitchen of an Italian restaurant before being taken to the pet shop or eating all of the food in said restaurant. And once taken to the pet shop, that was where he found and met John, who came in looking for a pet. According to the trailer, the film changes it so that Garfield is instead abandoned in a box in an alley as a kitten during a rainstorm, a lot like what happened in Disney's Oliver and Company, before escaping and coming upon an Italian restaurant where John just happened to be eating all by himself, before noticing Garfield outside the window before letting him in. And of course, if you've seen the trailer, you should know what happens when John lets Garfield in and gives him some of his food. Such a great example of comedy. Another reason that I think the Garfield movie will be good is because, according to the trailer, we get introduced to a character that's been referenced in a few early comics, as well as briefly in Garfield on the Town, which would be Garfield's father, Vic. We've seen Garfield's mother before in Garfield on the Town, as well as in Garfield His 9 Lives, in addition to a December 1984 arc of strips, where Garfield gets locked out of the house and runs away while John goes on a trip. But we've never really seen Garfield's father in any form of media before or after, until now. I think that this might actually be a good move for the film, because from what I remember hearing, they were originally going to make a third live-action film that would have featured Garfield's father and grandfather, the former to have been voiced by Steve Martin and the latter to have been voiced by Samuel L. Jackson. It's funny the way that I mentioned Samuel L. Jackson here, because according to the cast for the upcoming film, Jackson himself is actually providing the voice of Vic, after his roles of Mace Windu from the Star Wars prequel films, and especially Frozone from The Incredibles and Incredibles 2. And also, while Garfield was voiced by Bill Murray in the live-action films, taking over the role from Lorenzo Music, who passed away back in 2001, a lot of people, myself included, found Murray's portrayal of Garfield to be rather lifeless and one-note, compared to when Lorenzo Music voiced him in the Garfield specials and in Garfield and Friends. Frank Welker did an okay job trying to replicate Music's performance of the character in Garfield Gets Real, Garfield's Fun Fest, and Garfield's Pet Force, as well as the Garfield Show, which I will have to give him a B+ for trying. Now for this film, I'm sure that you all know this, but Garfield's voice is provided by none other than Chris Pratt. That's right, Mr. Star-Lord himself from the Guardians of the Galaxy films is now actually the fourth person to officially provide Garfield's voice. After his roles as Emmett from Warner Bros. The Lego Movie and its sequel, Barley Lightfoot from Disney and Pixar's Onward, and especially more recently, Mario from Illumination's The Super Mario Bros. Movie, it's inevitable that he would be picked to provide the voice of Garfield. And you know what? His portrayal is actually a pretty good improvement over Bill Murray's portrayal. And also another thing, this is actually the first time in the whole history of the Garfield franchise that Odie is not voiced by Greg Berger, but rather by Harvey Guillén, or however you pronounce his name, who was previously Perito in DreamWorks' Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I gotta say that it feels like this movie might end up being a big revolutionary thing for Garfield, with the intention of bringing him back into the spotlight. Not to mention that this is actually going to be the very first theatrical animated Garfield film ever released in the whole history of cinema. I mean, yeah, Jim Davis did previously attempt to make an animated Garfield feature film with Garfield's Judgment Day, but unfortunately, that one ended up not seeing the light of day due to how supposedly dark and edgy it was, compared to the previous Garfield specials, the comics, and especially Garfield and Friends. However, the documentary special Happy Birthday Garfield did include an excerpt of the film being in production, complete with singers Desiree Goyette and the late Lou Rawls singing a song that was to be used in the film. But other than that, that was it. Even though this never produced film ended up getting the picture book treatment instead. But good luck trying to find it in bookstores because it's been long out of print. The only chance you have of trying to find a copy of the book version of this never produced feature film is on eBay or even Amazon. But back to the Garfield movie. At least this ended up getting greenlit, even in spite of the fact that 20th Century Fox's license with Paws Inc., the company that owns the Garfield comics, ended up expiring back in 2016. Such a shame that had to happen, and even more of a shame that Fox ended up getting bought out by Disney 3 years later in 2019. Don't you just love it when corporate buyouts happen? Fortunately, most of the Garfield properties were bought by Viacom, now known as Paramount Global. But as for the film itself, it's going to be distributed by both Columbia and Sony. In a similar vein as that of other upcoming feature films, or even animated shows based on other existing properties, like the Garbage Pail Kids reboot series, or just recently, the feature-length VeggieTales Larry Boy film, the Garfield movie feels like it might just be an attempt to try and recapture the style of the Garfield comics. Another thing that I'm also hoping will happen in the film is that it'll have the characters sing songs that fit with the mood of the film, almost similar to a lot of the Disney animated feature films of the past, or even in the VeggieTales series. Yeah, a lot of the Garfield specials, as well as Garfield and Friends, did have the characters sing songs conveying their feelings about what's going on, but Garfield Gets Real, Garfield's Fun Fest, and Garfield's Pet Force didn't have the characters singing at all. Then again, it could be justified that those films were produced around the time that having the characters actually singing was not mandatory. At least most of the films produced by Don Bluth back in the 80s and the 90s had the characters sing songs to move the plot along, so I don't see any reason why this film shouldn't either. Even Cats Don't Dance, another film previously directed by Mark Dendel, as I've mentioned earlier, had the characters singing songs that fit with the mood and helped to move the plot along. To be fair, the music for the film is being composed by John Debney, who previously composed music for A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, before making his big break in composing the music for Jetsons the Movie, while also previously composing the music for The Emperor's New Groove and Chicken Little. He's really come a long way since composing the music for Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color and Ruby Spears' Dragon's Lair animated series, hasn't he? And now for the final reason why I think the Garfield movie will turn out to be really good. The animation. Oh my gosh, that is just the most fluid and vibrant animation that I've ever seen in my life. Sure, it's 3D animation, just like Garfield Gets Real, Garfield's Fun Fest, and Garfield's Pet Force, and even the Garfield Show, but compared to those productions, this animation is a lot more brighter than any of those films compared. It may not be as good as Pixar, DreamWorks, or even Illumination, but the animation is a huge improvement over the CGI Garfield films and the Garfield Show. The reason I say this is because sometimes franchises that have been around for a long time have been so accustomed to being animated in 2D animation, long before 3D animation became more well known, that if they're animated in 3D, the results will be either really good or really bad depending on the art style. In fact, there are some examples where the characters look really good animated in 3D, such as Mickey Mouse and the others in Disney's Mickey's Twice Upon a Christmas, or even Charlie Brown and the Gang in Blue Sky's The Peanuts movie. But on the other hand, There are others where the characters just look absolutely atrocious when animated in 3D, such as the Looney Tunes and Space Jam: A New Legacy. With this, at least the Garfield characters are animated in a much better 3D style than that of the Garfield show or the direct-to-video CGI Garfield films. You just have to stay true to the original art style in order to actually make it work. And those are the reasons why I think that the Garfield movie will be really good. It's still a long ways away until it actually comes to theaters, but it should be a huge improvement over how Garfield was animated in the Garfield show, and especially a massive improvement over the live-action films. And in spite of changing a few things around, at least the film doesn't fully contradict some things from the strip like the live-action films did. But enough about that. Anyway, that about does it for now. Do you think the Garfield movie will turn out good or not? Let me know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos from me. So until next time, later!